lesser known gems. And if everything goes as it's supposed to go, this will be published on 6th of February, which is the official day to celebrate the Sami people. And today we're going to talk about the Sami literature. So, the Sami people, for the uninitiated, is the indigenous groups who live in Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. I'm mostly going to talk about the Norwegian Sami. Now, in Norway, we mostly talk about 4 subcategories of the Sami population. It's the Northern Sami, it's the Southern Sami, it's the Lulu Sami, and it's the Coastal Sami. And we usually talk about 3 official Sami languages, which is the Northern Sami, Southern Sami, and Lulu Sami. Sami as a language is an official language in Norway. And when you talk about that, it means those 3 Sami languages. There are a lot of other Sami languages, but these are not recognized as a part of the official Sami languages in Norway. And this has to do with what the Norwegian government then is producing of Sami language elements. Either this is radio, television, or literature. Now, as with all literature, the Sami literature, in the sense that the Sami stories that have been told, started with the oral traditions. Now, when I started this project about learning more about Sami literature, I knew about one thing, which is joik. Joik is very often referred to as the musical element. So, but despite the fact that this is a musical element, in the sense that Bob Dylan has now been given the Nobel Prize in Literature, you can also read joik. And there has come a few books where, this is a Norwegian translation of it, where they perform it and you can sort of read it in the same way that you would read written song lyrics, as again with Bob Dylan. So in that sense, it is a story element. There is a lot of literal qualities with the joiks. But in addition to the joiks, you also have a more folktale, fairy tale elements of this. Folktales and fairy tales that existed within the Northern Sami subgroup. So this is just the Northern Sami, so not the other Sami subgroups, were collected in the 1920s and written down, and this was then edited again in the 1990s, where she took inspiration from the Sami drums in dividing in the different folk tales into different subcategories. The Sami drums, which is a huge aspect of Sami religion, is divided into 3 sort of categories, 3 kind of worlds. And she then divided the folk tales into these different categories, which were folk tales about the foreign, which is the top here, which had to do with things from another world or things from far away. And then you have fairy tales from our world, which are fairy tales and folk tales with root in everyday stuff. And then you have fairy tales about death, with the devil and something called upega, which are the dead babies who haven't been baptized. So those are the sort of roots within the oral tradition, though what they've been written down was much later. And then we're going to talk about what happens when you are writing down the literature. And there is somewhat discussion about what constitutes the first Sami book published. So someone talks about that it's Turi, which is the first published book. He wrote in 1910 a book about the reindeers and the way the Samis interact and deal with the reindeers, and starting sort of the next phase of this and a very active 5-year period. But before that, in 1904, you have Matti Aikio. Now, Matti Aikio is a very interesting person, and I do have own review of all of his books on my blog, so you can go and check it more in depth about him specifically. But he was a Sami who traveled south, learned Norwegian, and wrote in Norwegian about the Sami population. And he was one of the typical people caught between two worlds of the Sami population and the Norwegian population. So while a lot of people think In Reindeer Skin was his first book, and the book he sort of proclaims as his first book, his actual first book was King Akab, which was published in 1904 in Denmark. And while this is, I think the closest thing I can describe it as kind of an Attenborough perspective. And here you have the Sami population. Now let me talk about these weird groups who live in the north and do a lot of weird stuff. This is much more about his own personal relationship with his own Sami identity, and it's much more raw and probably closer to home than he wanted it to be, which is why he sort of didn't want to talk about this. The first novel that was published in the Sami language was published in 1912 by Anders Larsen, with the exception of Matti Aikio. From 1910 to 1915, you had a very active period with a lot of Sami writers who produced literature and published, and you had a lot of things like that. And then it stopped. And very little was published between 1915 and the 1970s. It became forbidden. You weren't allowed to use the Sami language. You weren't allowed to write about the Sami culture. So they sort of went very underground until around the 1970s, 1980s, when the Norwegian government identified the Samis as an indigenous group and said that these 4 groups, which are the groups we recognize in Norway, these 3 languages, which we recognize in Norway, we as a society and as a government are now going to try and protect them, and we really want you to start producing literature and other cultural expressions of Sami culture to kind of make up for what we did and sort of make sure that you don't die out. And therefore you sort of see that there is a surge in the literature produced from the 1970s. For example, Palto, which is the first female writer, and she produced in the 1970s. She was the first female Sami writer. And a lot of sort of new wave people between the 1970s to about the 2000, where a lot of new literature was produced. And what you also saw in between these groups wasn't just that the Samis were producing a lot more literature, a lot more books, in addition to a lot of other cultural expressions, but you also saw that they were producing cultural expressions on almost 2 levels. You had the level which was just getting it out there, but you also saw And he also saw some of this being translated into Norwegian for it to be accessible for the majority of society, because it was also an upsurge in trying to get the Norwegian majority to recognize and identify the Sami culture as something that was important and something that was a big part of Norwegian culture. But you also saw certain Sami writers that was very clear that a part of the Sami culture isn't for anyone besides Sami people. So what's interesting with, for example, this man, and I'm not going to try and pronounce his name, who wrote down yoiks. And what's interesting about this book, this is a Norwegian translation of one of his most famous books. In the introduction, he says, if you're a Sami, you might not recognize this book. You might ask, where are the pictures? Where are the photographs? Why is it so black and white? Well, this is because this is a translation for the Norwegian people. This isn't the original book. So he is clearly saying that this book isn't a part of the original expression, because the original expression is only meant for the Sami people. So I, as a Norwegian, aren't privileged to be a part of that because it's not made for me. And this is kind of an interesting concept and a very interesting discussion that the Sami population is now having, because due to this period within 1915 and 1970, a lot of people stopped sort of identifying as Sami. So people in my generation might have figured out, oh, my grandparents were Sami and my parents had no idea about that. They were not raised with the Sami language. They were not raised with the Sami culture. They were not raised with the Sami identification. So they don't know about the Sami languages, and then felt kind of excluded from these cultural expressions. They felt excluded from being a part of the Sami culture. And that is a discussion which is going on now within the Sami group itself. And I'm really not the right person to talk about that. I don't have any knowledge about that. I don't have any place to talk about that. But that's also an interesting aspect if you see on the literature produced after the 2000, when people in my generation who recognized that their parents were Sami, and the law stated that because of this, if you have one grandparent who was Sami, you have the right to claim the identity as Sami. So a lot of them then started to write Sami literature, which is Sami literature because they are Sami, and is recognized as that, but they're writing in Norwegian. So you have a more eclectic, heterogeneous group of Sami writers today who want to be a part of this and want to sort of celebrate their identity, but who don't necessarily know the Sami language. So that was a very, very, very short summary about Sami literature, a bit about different topics that you're talking about within this subgroup regarding taking care of the language, taking care of the culture, and making sure that everyone is included at the same time as some might be excluded and everything like that. So, as always, leave your comments and questions down below. I'll do the best to answer them, though, as I stated, I'm not Sami. So I can't really speak on behalf of how a Sami feels things, stuff like that. And remember, gratulerer med dagen, alle sammen. And it's better to be a witty fool than a foolish wit.